Hey there, welcome to our channel where we talk about subjects about retire early lifestyle that most bloggers won't touch. Police harassment. Well, we know what it is in our own country. What about when we go abroad? That would be one of the things that could make people just be a lot more timid about. What about the legal system? This is a question I used to see years ago, and it is a concern because you hear, you watch movies, you see things, you hear things, and you say, gee, what if something like that happened? We don't have the protections. They don't have the protections that we have. They don't, it's just a totally different legal system. What if you get embroiled, this kind of thing, that kind of thing? I have to tell you, there's two sides to this story. One of them is that you've got systems where the general feel of the place is peaceful. And like in Ecuador, when we first got to Ecuador, I mentioned that it was, you got a sense that it was a tranquil, peaceful little place. Now, it also can be that they really welcome foreigners and tourists and foreign money, and so they're very easygoing towards foreigners. This was the general ambience of going abroad pre-2020. Post-2020, things have changed. We used to talk about you enter into a store or a place and people will get uptight because you weren't polite. You forgot to say buenos dias, And I mean, Angie still reminds me, you forgot to say buenos dias, But post-2020, they're the ones not saying buenos dias. The locals are the ones. I'm just saying that things have changed. There's a pre-2020 and a post-2020. And we have to highlight that difference because a lot of times these conversations morph into how things were. And they are put out still to this day as if things are the way they used to be, and they aren't. Because now people act like totally different, and they're the ones not being polite, not being buenos dias. But beyond being polite, that does carry through to the way governments treat people, regardless whether they're foreign or not. And there is a pre-2020 and a post-2020. So you had the countries that were very welcoming, very inviting to foreigners, putting out the welcome mat, whether it was in law or in fact, like places like Panama had a specific setup in law where retirees got a special deal, they got half off on everything. And then you had other places like Ecuador where they didn't actually put that in law, but they still treated you that way when you got there. And other places like Costa Rica, 30 years ago, Mexico, that kind of thing. But again, that was pre-2020. Post-2020, we've got a scenario here where all of a sudden nobody has any welcome mat. Everybody's the same. Everybody is being treated the same, and they're all subject to potential encounters with the police. I have to tell you, it sounds like I may have addressed both sides of the story, but that was only one side. The second side is, it was a two-part one side, the first side, and the second side of this, it really is up to you. Well, it was up to you, it was up to us pre-2020, and this conversation kind of morphs because of the pre-2020 and post-2020. In a nefarious system, in a Marxist system, in an antagonistic, aggressive, statist system, whatever you want to call it, authoritarian, statist, there's a bunch of other labels we can affix to it. But the bottom line is it's not a friendly system. And the way that's done is usually you pass 1,000 laws so that everybody's guilty of something. And you know what we're referring to nowadays. You walk into a store, and if you don't do things like everybody else, well, they're afraid of you. They don't say buenos dias. They're uptight. And things have changed. And that morphs and carries itself into our encounters or potential encounters with the police. And I was going to say that because I said that it was up to us pre-2020, post-2020, it's so much more like a spider web that catches everybody, even if you are normally the type of person that avoids confrontation, that is friendly and outgoing, avoids problems, goes just really over the top and out of their way to avoid confrontations and problems. Even so, post-2020, we find that the nefarious, statist, all of the above labels, conditions that has been dropped on the world in just about every country is now snagging even those of us, or attempting to snag, even those of us that are normally on this other side of the coin. And so you might think, well, I'm not confrontational. I don't go around looking for trouble. But here's the thing. There are differences in the cultures. And one of the great differences that we really enjoyed about coming abroad was the live and let live part of the Latin culture. Live and let live is huge. There's no live and let live in North America. It's the complete opposite, at least it was. You let me know in the comments if things have changed. I would imagine that there are probably particular areas where people are starting to get it, that loving your neighbor and being live and let live is a much better and more peaceful way to live than the way most people live in North America, where every little thing, they think that the state is there to do their bidding, to please them and make them feel better. And so, you call the cops on your neighbor because you don't like the way they live, or you don't like them at all, or you don't like something about them. And the state is all too eager to do the bidding of a neighbor against neighbor. And so that was one of the great refreshing things about going abroad, is that you didn't have that. And so how does it come to the story? Well, the story is, I had to do all that prefacing because, as you know, we've been abroad 10 years. I've never had any conflict with the police at all because of all the stated reasons. So I met this guy. We were waiting outside. And one of the wonderful things of having a YouTube channel is that people, amazingly enough, you can be who knows what part of the world, somebody recognizes you from watching your videos. And he ran into us and we were chit-chatting, and he said, why don't you make a video about the police? And he said, well, he had a scenario where his neighbors were doing something that was offensive to him. This is a key, very important point of this video and why I had to preface it. Sometimes people say, you're too long, cut it short, get to the point. But had I not told you all of that, you wouldn't get the complete flavor of what I'm saying now, which is that you may or may not agree with this fellow. You may say, well, gosh, if the neighbors were doing that, I would call the police. But that's exactly the point. He did call the police on his neighbors. He called the police on his neighbors because he thought it was the right thing to do. You've got to understand there's a principle here. It's a very unknown principle. And the principle is willingness to be defrauded. And it's a biblical principle. And I don't know how that sounds to you, but what it means is that what it's saying is not to go to court to fight things out in a peaceful, loving society that is not, you have situations where you have a conflict and there's no choice. But for you to initiate a confrontation by calling the police on your neighbor because you're unhappy about something is not the only way. The other way is suffering to be defrauded. You suffer. It's like I made this video a while back saying how the expat neighborhood, because we live like locals, we've never paid more than $300 or $400 for 3 and 4 bedroom houses and apartments, furnished and unfurnished, just about everywhere we go, definitely under 500. And so you see a big difference between, like, for example, in Cuenca, Ecuador, you see these neighborhoods where there's lots and lots of gringos, and you can just see the flavor of the place. Totally different than where we live among the locals. In the Gringo neighborhood, you've got these signs up, call the police if anybody makes noise, call 911, this, that. It's like the States. Whereas in the local neighborhood, you don't have any of that. On the other hand, you do have situations where, like, locals are having parties and it's noisy, and what do? Well, in the interest of peace, and this is something a lot of people don't get. They don't understand this because they come from a different culture, and this is what they know, this is what they grew up with, this is the way life has been for them, and this is the way they reason. And they reason, well, it's my property, I shouldn't have to suffer anything. I should be able to call the police and enforce my will on the neighbor. But see, when you look at it like that, that means that neighbors can do the same thing to you. You see how that works? That's the whole point of this story, is that the guy called the police on the locals. And the thing about Latin cultures is that you've heard that it's a more family culture, and it's somewhat that way also in the south of the U.S. where you have families that, just whole large families that are nearby. They're either right there on the property, or they're next door, or they're not too far. And then you have, because of that, you've got their friends, and so you don't have like one family. Maybe you have mom and dad, and you have 2 or 3 sons, and then you've got their families, and then their cousins, and and then you have all the friends of all of these people. So you've got a pretty large village or community within a community, a family. And so when you cross somebody, that's the point. When you cross somebody because you didn't like something, you call the cops on them. It is fair to say that either because of this large village group, either somebody within the family is a policeman or they're friends with a policeman. And so if you tick them off, they can turn around and do the same to you, and you can get harassed. And that's what happened to this fellow. He was recounting the story to me. And he was telling me the story how he was hassled by the police. He was stopped for no reason. He was rustled. He was checked for ID. He was even arrested. Mind you, there was no crime committed. He was just being singled out. The whole reason he was being singled out is because he made the first move. So this is an area that a lot of people don't understand, the difference in culture. You've got to be live and let live. You've got to be willing to be defrauded. You've got to be willing to suffer, whatever it is, in the name of freedom. Not an actual trespass. Clearly there are boundaries, and then there are boundaries. But and that's the subject of a different video. But the bottom line is he initiated, and they ended it. He was pretty upset that he got rustled up. He got arrested. They even stole a few bucks he had in his wallet. They went all the way. They took his mace canister, and he was pretty bruised up emotionally and psychologically. And of course, it went up in front of the judge, and it didn't hold water. There was no actual charges, and they let him go. But that wasn't the point. He was treated like a criminal, and he didn't like it, and he was telling me about it, hoping I would talk about it on a video. And the thing is that it has been 100% my intention to not cross my neighbor, to not infringe on my neighbor, not to make the first move on my neighbor, unless they're actually coming over the wall, right? If they're actually physically coming over my wall, then they are a thief and a robber. Then yes, then I will call the police. But because they're doing something that I don't like or is offensive to me, I have not, and I'm not saying that hasn't happened to me, but I have not, and it's been intentional, called the police on my neighbor ever since I've been abroad. And because of that, I have never had the retribution. Doesn't mean you can't be in the wrong place at the wrong time. I don't hang out in really big cities. I don't go out at night and all these things that we talk about. Stay away from trouble areas, bars, and this kind of thing. But remember, the fellow that recounted this story didn't do any of those things either. So it comes right back to him making the first move and just simply suffering the retribution of his neighbor. So remember, when it comes to freedom and liberty, if you want your freedom and you want your liberty, remember that what goes around comes around, and don't initiate, and then maybe you won't have this kind of story to tell. Let me know in the comments what you think. Thanks for coming to our channel. Have a wonderful day.